The information in this video is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. Please make informed decisions and take responsibility for your own health choices.
The only reason those drugs work is because they calm the patient down. They're major tranquilizers. They don't cure anything. Matter of fact, none of their psychiatric drugs cure anything. All they're doing is treating symptoms, and they're making billions of dollars a year doing this.
Hey, I'm so glad you're here. This interview with Jerry Marzinsky is one I've been looking forward to sharing. His experience inside psychiatric hospitals and what he's uncovered about the voices people hear, it's intense and it's important. Quick heads up, my audio had some issues during the recording. Not terrible, I was able to enhance it, and Jerry's is crystal clear. I've also added captions to make it easy to follow. And before we dive in, if this conversation stirs something in you and you're looking for natural, grounded tools to stay emotionally and spiritually clear, I've created a free guide for you. It's called 3 Essential Oils for Mental Clarity and Spiritual Protection, and it's straight from my own wellness rhythm. You can grab it at bit.ly/oils for clarity. All right, let's get into it.
Welcome back to New View, New Life, the series where we explore empowering new perspectives that can lead to better health, deeper clarity, and a more aligned life. I'm Sherilyn, your host, and I'm so glad you're here. Today, I'm honored to be speaking with Jerry Marzinsky, a retired licensed psychotherapist with over 35 years of experience working closely with and studying the thought processes and voices heard by psychotic and criminally insane patients. His work took place in some of the most volatile psychiatric institutions in the country, giving him a rare and direct view into areas of the human mind that most of us never encounter. Jerry was awarded the State of Arizona's Meritorious Service Award while working in the psychology department of a large state prison. He also received Pima College's Apple Award for teaching abnormal psychology. Beyond the clinical world, Jerry has held the rank of second lieutenant in the Arizona Civil Air Patrol, is a licensed commercial pilot, a certified scuba diver, a long-distance motorcycle rider, and served as an assistant scoutmaster. His academic training includes a BA in psychology from Temple University, a master's in counseling from the University of Georgia, and 2 years of PhD study in psychology. He is the co-author of An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind, Breaking the Spell of the Ivory Tower, a book that challenges much of what we've been taught about mental illness. In today's conversation, we'll dive into Jerry's unique insight, his lived experience working on the front lines of psychiatry, and what he's come to understand about the deeper forces at play in the world of mental health. Jerry, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're more than welcome. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. I'm so excited. Well, can we start with what you expected to learn when you entered the field of psychology?
Well, I expected to learn more about how my mind worked, but it didn't do that. Everything I was expecting from psychology, for the most part, never materialized. Where do thoughts come from? How does the mind work? There were only partial answers. I was fairly disappointed, and after 6 years of higher education, finishing my BA in psychology and a master's degree in counseling, nothing prepared me for going to work in one of the largest mental hospitals on the planet. The education just, it was a totally different experience than anything that I was expecting.
Wow.
And the vast majority of what I learned in college didn't help at all.
Oh my goodness. So what kinds of things did you encounter instead of, that's what I would expect too, talking about thoughts, right? Or maybe even the spirit, since the word psyche has more to do with the spirit or soul even than the mind,
Well, it may contain that implication, but psychology doesn't deal with spirit. Psychiatry doesn't deal with spirit. Social workers don't deal with spirit. And we're spiritual entities. We're spiritual beings. You know, we're energetic beings. Your thoughts are energy. Your mind is energy. Your feelings are energy. Your memories are energy. And everything about you is energy. You're an energetic being. And all psychiatry does is dump drugs on your brain, dope you up. Well, all they're doing is treating symptoms. They're not getting at the root cause of anything. And neither is psychology for the most part.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've been in therapy before. I've, talked many hours with psychologists, and a lot of that is about thinking and thoughts. You would think they would have been taught something about our thoughts, or they didn't have any explanation for that at all.
No, they didn't dwell on it very much at all. As a matter of fact, they didn't dwell a whole lot on schizophrenia. When I ran into abnormal psychology, it was like they were just descriptions of these mental illnesses. I mean, they weren't, there was nothing in there about what to do about it. They were just detailed descriptions. And at that time, I just believed everything they said.
Yeah.
And
what do you say about schizophrenia?
Very little. They had a description of it. They had a description of all the facets, all the different kinds. What they said, it was a chemical brain imbalance. And that's what I believed when I started working also. Mm-hmm. But as time went on, and on the front lines, I was watching what was going on compared to what they taught me. It didn't match up at all. So I started seeing these contradictions, and one of the ones was that schizophrenia is due to a chemical brain imbalance in the patient's brain. And at the time, I believed that. That's what they were teaching in medical schools. That's what they were teaching in psychology. That's what they were teaching through the universities. I didn't know at that time that the medical field had been taken over by the Rockefellers, decades ago, with their they paid for a huge study, and then they pushed it and paid off Congress to pass it. And it basically said that the only way to treat anything is physical drugs. So they banned any medical institution that was going to license doctors from teaching anything except pharmacological medicine. And anybody who did that, they wouldn't allow them to graduate their medical students. So they outlawed naturopathy, they outlawed acupuncture, they outlawed Tesla's violet ray, anything other than their pharmacological drugs. And the report was called the Flexner Report.
Oh.
It was I think it was back in the early 50s or something like that. So at that point, they took over the universities, and they went, okay, you don't graduate from a program that teaches pharmacological medicine. Your degree is worth nothing. Let me see if I can find something on that. Let me see, selection report. Well, that's where they took over the universities, and they're still running the universities. A lot of what's published only gets published if the AMA and these big pharma that runs the thing approves of it. So if AMA or the pharmacological people don't like what you're writing, there's a good chance it's not going to get published. So the biochemical imbalance thing, came from, it was a lie made up by one of the drug companies. So in the late 1980s, after the release of their landmark antidepressant Prozac, the idea of the chemical imbalance hit the psychiatric mainstream. As the psychiatrist Peter Brigham in 1991 points out in his book Toxic Psychiatry, the drug company Eli Lilly advanced the chemical imbalance theory as a marketing scheme to sell their drug Prozac. It was a lie at the time. They went with it anyway. They're after the money. There was no demonstrable evidence showing that depressed patients had any kind of chemical imbalance in their brain, but Lilly ran with it. Before long, psychiatrists and psychiatric patients alike came to identify with the idea that mental disorders were caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain of the mentally ill person. There is no chemical imbalance in the brain of anybody mentally ill. It took they got away with this for almost 2 decades. Complete lie. It was fabricated to try to explain to people why their drugs worked, and it was totally made up. I didn't know it at the time. What I saw at the time is after I graduated from graduate school and went to work at this, probably one of the biggest psychiatric hospitals on the planet, I watched what the psychiatrists were doing. And I'd go into their offices with some of my patients, and we'd sit through, the psychiatric exam with the psychiatrist. And you would think if there was a chemical imbalance in the brain, they would have some kind of lab test or some kind of objective test to test for it. Never saw it, and after 2 or 3 times of sitting through these things, I finally asked one. I said, well, if these guys are schizophrenic and they have a chemical imbalance of their brain, then how do you know what's out of balance or by how much? There's like 23 neurotransmitters or something like that in the brain. And I never see you give any tests. You don't give any lab work. You don't give any, blood work. You don't give any EEG, EK. You don't give any kind of objective test to determine what's out of balance or by how much. And I found out that they didn't have one. None ever existed. They don't even know what the chemical balance of the brain should be. So, and I finally asked them, I asked one of them, I said, if you're not given any tests, then how do you know what's out of balance or by how much? And the psychiatrist said, well, we just trust the drug companies to kind of do that research for us, and we just do what they recommend. And it's like, oh my God, it's like letting the fox loose in the hen house.
But it's not conflict of interest.
Oh yeah, big time conflict of interest.
The people profiting off of the drugs are the ones teaching the psychiatrists and licensing them, etc.
Yeah, and they're still doing this. They're still teaching this in the universities today, even though it's been debunked a decade or so ago.
Oh my goodness.
They're still pushing it because that makes money for the drug companies.
So how was it debunked?
How was it debunked? Well, the biochemical people finally started doing the research on it. So they started out with first they started out blaming mothers. Mothers did something to cause their kids schizophrenia, and the mothers run. What do we do? Well, what do we do? So whatever they did was observable. So they didn't find anything there. There wasn't anything consistent. So they kicked it up to genetics. And they said, well, there's got to be a genetic cause for mental illness and schizophrenia. So they got away with that probably for another 20 years. And finally, some biochemists got around to examining it and said, well, listen, or the geneticist guys got around to looking at it, and they said, we don't find a gene for schizophrenia. It's not there. So the drug companies came back and went, well, it's not just one gene. It's a whole bunch of genes all mixed together. And then we'll find it eventually, but it's genetics. We're sure, it never played out. So what they're doing is kicking it up where people can't see it, So when you kick it up to the geneticist, there's only a very small number of people that can actually see what's going on. and they're not finding anything. The average Joe, the average doctor, the average psychiatrist, they're not going to be able to tell if there's a genetic abnormality. Now, what they did find was that there was a correlation between schizophrenic parents and schizophrenic kids. But correlation doesn't mean causation. I've seen schizophrenic parents treat their kids in a way that would set off schizophrenia, would kind of plant, prepare the ground for it. And even talked to a couple that said, well, listen, I put up with my schizophrenic mother for years, and I finally had to move away because I started hearing the voices also, from the way she was behaving and treating them. So, here's some psychiatrists said there's not a single peer-reviewed article that can be accurately cited directly support claims that serotonin deficiency, and that's what the drug companies were saying with the Prozac, that serotonin deficiency in any mental disorder, while there are many articles that present counter evidence. So what Lily was saying was that there was a lack of serotonin in the neurological synapses in the neurons. These guys didn't find it. Ronald Pies, he was one of the top psychiatrists of his day. He said the demise of the chemical imbalance theory in view of the mounting evidence against it, after more than 20 years of being told that a chemical imbalance in the brain causes mental illness such as anxiety disorder, depression, schizophrenia, etc. The theory was finally put to rest when Dr. Donald Pies, editor-in-chief emeritus of the Psychiatric Times, stated in the July 11th, 2011 issue of the Psychiatric Times, I don't believe I've ever heard a knowledgeable, well-trained psychiatrist make such a preposterous claim as there being a chemical imbalance in the brain that causes mental illness. So here's the Flexner report. This is where Carnegie took over the medical establishment. In 1910, the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Group sponsored the infamous Flexner report, which shut down any medical school teaching subjects outside of mainstream pharmacology. The edict was so powerful that only a few medical schools survived, such as Johns Hopkins and McGill, and a handful of others connected with these groups. They were the only schools who could legally license doctors. Doctors who practice any method beside pharmacology were threatened with the loss of their license. Doctors caught using Tesla's violet ray or acupuncture were labeled quacks and threatened with the loss of their medical license. So here's the deep state took over the medical establishment back then, and psychiatry is one of the worst of their ilk. I mean, the lies that they have told the Western society are just phenomenal. Okay.
You really got to walk the line if you're anywhere in that field, right? And if you
you know what they do? They brainwash you in school. You know, that's one thing I hated about psychology when I was going through. I mean, but when I started college, I didn't trust authority hardly at all. You know, I did trust professors until I found out they couldn't be trusted either. You know, for me, that was a shocker. And I remember when I was going through abnormal psychology, they assigned us a paper to read, written by a clinical psychologist. And it said that if two schizophrenics met one another and they both had the same delusion, so if both of them thought they were carny, one of them would have to change to something else. You know? And even as an undergraduate, I went, why would that have to happen? I mean, they're both crazy. Why would one of them have to change because the other one thought he was Jesus Christ? I mean, I thought that was ridiculous. But one thing I hated about psychology is you couldn't get access to a clinical population. You know, getting access to a clinical population to study is almost impossible. You know, they will feed you all this crap saying, oh no, we can't let you onto the psych ward because it's way too dangerous. We just can't take the risk. You know, that's a bunch of crap. But, I've worked, 40 years on psych wards and ERs doing psych crisis, that kind of stuff. I'd never been attacked by a psychiatric patient, and very few others had either. I mean, there were some that got hurt. I know, maybe one or two, but who was getting hurt the most were psychiatrists, and that puzzled me, that when I went to work at this big state hospital, I always wondered, why are these psychiatrists being attacked at a rate higher than virtually any of the other staff? What are they saying to these guys? Because they were only spending 15 or 20 minutes a month with them. And even then, they were just asking them about their medications. It took me 7 years to figure that one out.
Wow.
But another duplicity that psychiatry has come up with is their Bible, their Bible of mental illnesses,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's all made up. It's a work of fiction. They made up every single one of those diagnoses.
Wow.
If you look in the DSM, it's like they're very well organized, and they got all these numbers, and they got all these detailed descriptions and all this kind of stuff. And they make it look like it's cut and dried. This is this is an infection, and this is a rash, and like medical illness. They make it look like that, but that's not the way it worked. They bleed into one another. And I remember when the bunch of us were taking abnormal psychology, we go, well, we got that, and we got that, and we got this, and we got that. And, we're like, well, we got all these things, So it's not a cut and dried thing. And the other thing I saw is that they didn't put any solutions in there.
Yeah.
It was just descriptions of mental illnesses. And, it's a complete work of fiction. Every single one of the more than 296 psychiatric disorders in the DSM-5 and later have been completely made up by a group of psychiatrists. Made up. There's not a single objective test. There's no lab test. There's no EEG or EK. There's no test whatsoever. Any kind of objective test that will definitively diagnose any of these. Many of these. There's almost 500 or 300 of them now. And they're making up more all the time.
Yeah. For one thing, the mind is a completely different thing than the body. They think it's the brain, right?
Yeah, but they were trying to pass this off as like at one time they tried to get these diagnoses to make them look like they were a disease of some kind, an illness of some kind, and the medical people just went, no, you're pushing it too far now. They wouldn't let the psychiatrists do it. They wouldn't let them pull that off. So every single one of the more than 296 psychiatric disorders in the DSM-5 or later have been completely made up. The list of fabricated mental disorders appears to be increasing astronomically with each new edition of the DSM. So they're making up more all the time. In 1980, the list was 256. And now the DSM-5 is 297. In 1952, there were only 106. So it went from 106 to 256 to 297, and every 3 years they're making up more, and they're looking for drugs to treat them, because they're making a fortune on the sale of drugs.
Exactly, because the more disorders you have, the more drugs you can sell, right?
Yeah. There are no blood tests. There are no lab tests. There's no x-rays. These are just classes of behaviors that are grouped together by psychiatrists and voted into existence. Psychiatrist Julian Whitaker said that. Every single one of the DSM is defined by a list of behavioral symptoms that committees of psychiatrists have debated and decided which clusters of symptoms add up to which labels or mental disorders. 2/3 of the psychiatrists on that board that are making up these mental disorders are associated with Big Pharma. They have ties with Big Pharma.
So they're profiting off of
They're
it.
profiting off it big time. Mm.
So how did you get started working with schizophrenics, and what is the symptomology for that? How did you start questioning whether or not these were hallucinations? How did that start?
Basically, this symptoms of the basic symptoms of schizophrenia, they say are auditory or visual hallucinations or a break with reality. Reality as normal people see it.
Right.
You know, schizophrenics will hear voices. Sometimes they don't know if they're their own voice, and they run patterns. They run very precise patterns. Now, psychiatry has labeled auditory hallucinations or voices that the schizophrenics hear as auditory hallucinations. They didn't do any studies on them. They didn't ask the patients what the voices are saying. They didn't do any research on those voices at all. It's like they went, in their infinite arrogance, they just went, we're psychiatrists, and we hereby declare that the voices that schizophrenics hear are hallucinations.
So when you first started being exposed to them, you started asking that, right? And you were expecting that they would have looked into this.
Well, I was brainwashed by them also. So when I started working at this big giant state hospital, I believed everything I was taught, because I couldn't get onto a psych ward. I couldn't get into a mental hospital. You just have to believe whatever they teach you, and I didn't like that. That really, and I was telling you about the one where we were given this paper that, if two psychotic guys with the same delusion met each other, one of them would have to give way. So fast forward probably another 8 or 10 years, I was working at this big psychiatric hospital, and a lot of the stuff that I'd been taught in school wasn't making sense from what I was seeing with my own eyes. One of which was these hallucinations. When you say hallucinations, you think of, they're all over the place. They're unpredictable. That's, so I'm looking, I thought when they taught us that, the hallucinations that schizophrenics hear were hallucinations, I thought like word salad, like doesn't make any sense. They're just incoherent ramblings. Mm-hmm. That's not what I started seeing. I started seeing these patients walking around carrying on complex, coherent conversations with something or someone I couldn't see. So it was kind of like, you hear somebody talking on a telephone and you can hear what that person is saying, but you can't hear what the other person that's coming over the telephone is saying. So that's what it was like. So I remember there was one lady, she was arguing with her voices that she didn't want to leave the hospital grounds, saying, I don't want to leave the hospital grounds. I don't want to get in trouble, and arguing with the voices, telling them I don't want to do this. I don't want to leave, as she's walking off the hospital grounds. So this guy this one guy, I was doing my rounds on the second floor, and he was talking to somebody I couldn't see, and I wanted to creep up on him and see if I couldn't hear what was going on, what he was saying. Okay. And I got close and he caught me. Oh. And, I asked him, I said, hey, you're new here. I haven't seen you before. I said, I'm Jerry. I'm the psych on this unit. What's your name? And he says, I'm Jesus Christ. And I thought back to that paper and I looked at him and I said, no, you're not Jesus Christ. I am. And I'm going, okay, what's he going to do? So I'm sitting there waiting to see if this, whatever this clinical psychology wrote, 8 or 10 years ago was the truth. So the guy starts thinking, he cocks his eyes up and he's thinking about it. And then he looks at me and he goes, okay, we can both be Jesus Christ, and strolled off. I'm going, okay, what else did they lie to me about? So here's another lie that came out. So here's they lied about the biochemical imbalance. and I found that out by watching the way they diagnose these people. They just kind of off the cuff, well, we'll start with this drug and we'll try this and then we'll try this one and then we'll try this one and that doesn't work, we'll increase or decrease. It was all about drugs. They didn't spend hardly any time talking to these people at all. I did, but using the counseling techniques I was taught in graduate school, and it was like trying to shoot a rhino in the butt with a BB rifle to get it to move. None of those worked. It was like talking to a rock. Whatever was going on in their heads just wasn't rational, and it couldn't be impacted by just talking to them. It just didn't work. So I'm like, okay, what's going on? What's what are they hearing? Now, what I did see was that there was a one-to-one correlation between them getting into trouble and they're listening to the voices. All right? And I'm like, well, what are these things? What are the voices? And all psychology says is, well, they're just hallucinations. They're just the auditory and visual hallucinations. So like they're hearing things and they're seeing things that the rest of us don't, which is true. But it turns out that in reality, all of us hear those voices. They barge into our heads as intrusive thoughts. They come in and it's this horrible intrusive thought that doesn't belong to you, and you sense it doesn't belong to you. So they're hitting all of us, but they really hit schizophrenics hard. So I started asking these guys, what are the voices telling? And what I found is they started to run patterns. So first of all, they were consistently negative. They always talked negative stuff. They were insulting, they were abusive, they were destructive, they were derogatory. You're stupid, you're ugly, you're crazy, nobody loves you. Then everybody's talking behind your back, they're plotting against you. It was all this negative stuff to scare the bejesus out of them. And it didn't wander from that for that. Regular hallucinations, some of them might be positive, some of them negative, and some of them neutral. They're all over the place. The voices weren't. They were consistently negative. And I talked to scores of schizophrenic patients about their voices, and all of them reported that they were negative. So I'm like thinking, okay, well, why aren't they random like all other hallucinations? Why aren't they all over the place like regular hallucinations? And I've seen, working in the hospitals, I've seen hallucinations. They're all over the place. They don't run patterns. But this was the first pattern I noticed. The second pattern I noticed was that they were anti-religious. They didn't like the victim going to church. They didn't like them reading the Bible. They didn't like them praying. They didn't like them reading the 23rd Psalm. They didn't like them going to any kind of positive spiritual activity. And I noticed that when I was doing rounds on the ward I was assigned to. The schizophrenics, when the chaplain had ice cream socials, they never went. They laid on the dingy ward and were looking at monster movies or reading murder mystery books or negative stuff. And the first time I noticed that, I went, well, that's pretty strange. How come they're not down there getting cake and ice cream with all the other patients?
Oh, wow.
And they weren't. When cake and ice cream were hard to come by there. So I noticed that a second time. The third time I noticed that, I started asking them about it. And they were telling me, well, I don't like preachers. They were liars. I prayed to God and he never answered anything. There is no God. And, I don't want to deal with preachers. They were just totally anti-religious. And then one day, one of my patients came and I was talking to him and he said, when the voices came, I prayed the 23rd Psalm. And he said the voices reacted like worms thrown on a hot frying pan. They hated it. And I went, well, that's interesting. So I started handing out the 23rd Psalm to my schizophrenic patients and said, yeah, say this every time the voices come. I'll bring you back in a week and tell me what happened. The voices hated it. They all hated it. It was consistent. So
Wow.
I started asking questions. I said, have you ever gone to church? And they go, yeah. Because most of them are tried. And they broke down into 3 different levels. After asking dozens of these people, what happens when you go to church? It turned out that if the voices were not really strong, that the voices would disappear when they went into church. The voices were moderate strength, they'd get louder, and they'd start mocking the preacher and interfering with the patient listening to what the preacher had to say. So they would interfere and they'd act up. They didn't like it. They'd tell him to leave. They'd say stuff like, Jesus couldn't even save himself. What makes you think he's going to save you? So they were anti-religious. It was weird. And then the ones that had real strong voices, the voices would drive them out of church. They'd get up and they would run out of the church.
Mm.
So after asking dozens of these guys about what happens, how the voices react, when they try to read the Bible or stuff, it was clear that the voices were anti-religious. Now, what kind of hallucination would be anti-religious?
Yeah.
So
Right.
here's all these patterns starting to appear, one after another. And I was asking these guys all kinds of questions. Then one day the voices, I guess they got mad with one patient, and he went to one of the psychiatrists and said, hey, this guy's asking me all these questions about the voices, and I don't like it. It's upsetting me. Next morning, I ended up in the psychiatrist's office, and he was lecturing me. He said, these voices are hallucinations. By you asking questions about them, you're reinforcing those hallucinations and making the patient sicker. And I knew that was a bunch of crap at the time, but you can't argue with a psychiatrist. They're like the gods of mental health. They're very arrogant for the most part. So,
you know what? It's interesting because I've had my own battles with mental illness in the past, and one time a psychiatrist told me, we were discussing psychosis, and I had a roommate at the time who was schizophrenic, and he told me, he said, you can't reason with a psychotic. And as you're talking about this, it kind of sounds like that's what you were dealing with, talking with the psychiatrist. You couldn't reason with him.
No, that would have been fired had they found out that I was investigating this stuff. That happened twice. They won't even look into it. They don't want anything upsetting their little apple cart and all the money they're making doing this bullcrap that they're doing.
I mean, isn't one of the definitions of delusion or psychosis being separated from reality of what's actually going on? And it's
well, it's our reality. They have a reality of their own that has its own laws and its own patterns.
Yeah. If there is something actually going on there, which we'll get into in a second, then I would say that the individuals who are denying that reality are actually delusional, right? If there isn't a reality going on that the schizophrenics are actually perceiving, which hopefully you'll expand on in a minute, that you started to suspect that these were not hallucinations, but that they were actually perceiving something real.
Yeah, they're actually perceiving something that's real, and that real, it runs patterns. So I had to be careful in the state hospital. Like I said, psychiatrists were getting beat up by schizophrenics at a rate equal to the assault on attendant staff. These are staff that are with the patients 24 hours a day, which didn't make any sense. Why are they getting beat up? What are they doing? What are they saying? And the times that I was in the office with the psychiatrists and the patients, I didn't hear them say anything that would, really piss off the patients, except they had to take their medications. And it turned out that that's what it was. It took 7 years to find that out. At the end of 7 years, so what I was working for back then was the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. And what we were doing was looking for the highest functioning patients in that big hospital and training them in vocational skills to get them out of the hospital. But usually the highest functioning were the schizophrenics, but they couldn't function because of their hallucinations. So that's psychiatry calls them. If they were on their meds, they could function. But they didn't want to stay on those meds. They kept going off the meds. And it was like, well, why are they doing this? Why are they going off the meds all the time and returning to psychiatry, to being psychotic? Do they want to be psychotic? Because virtually all of them would go off their meds at one time or another. They just quit taking them. And that puzzled me too, because back then the only thing they had to treat schizophrenia were those medications. We didn't know, and counseling certainly wasn't working. So I started asking them, everyone that went off their meds, I'd ask them, well, why'd you go off your meds? Their first response was because of the side effects. The side effects are terrible. Well, that was true. The side effects were terrible. They were awful. They'd turn them into walking zombies half the time. But compared to being psychotic, the side effects were bad, but they weren't as bad as being crazy, from what I could see. So I went to the DSM and I pulled up all these symptoms of psychosis, and I made a check sheet out of it. And then when one of my patients went off their medications, I'd pull them back in later after they were stabilized on their meds again. And I'd go, well, you're in trouble for going off your meds. If you go off your meds 3 times, you're going to be discharged from this program. Why did you go off your meds? Do you want to be crazy? They go, no, I don't want to be crazy. Well, then why'd you go off your drugs? You know what happens when you go off your drugs. You go nuts. And I'd say, what'd you do it for? And they go, I don't know. So they maintained that the only reason they were going off their drugs was because of the side effects. So I made that check sheet with all the psychotic symptoms. And when one went off their meds after they reconstituted, I'd bring them in and I'd go, why'd you go off your drugs? And, oh, it was the side effects. And then I'd say, okay, here, write down on this sheet of paper, what side effects did you have? And they'd write down 3 or 4 or 5 side effects. And then I'd give them the sheet with a check sheet of all the psychotic symptoms. And I'd say, okay, check all these horrible psychotic symptoms you had while you were, psychotic. And it was, they're awful, hearing nasty voices threatening them, seeing monsters in the dark, being paranoid of everybody around. It's just awful. I mean, it's a hell on earth. Right? Yeah. And I'd have them fill out both those sheets, and then I'd hand them back to them, and I'd say, which one is worse? 100% of the time they said being psychotic was worse. Right? And I said, then why'd you go off your meds? The answer I got at that point was, I don't know. Every single one of them, 3 years of I don't know, more than that. It was years of I don't know. I felt like, asking the same question over and over again, expecting a different response. But I'm hoping that somebody would answer that question. So at the end of the 7th year, there was a girl who went off her meds, and 3 times. So she was about to be discharged, and she was in the beauty school. She was just about to graduate. She sabotaged herself, which they were all doing. As they were about to graduate, as they were nearing success, they would do something to sabotage themselves and get thrown out of the program or get into trouble. She was about to be discharged because she went off 3 times. And but I called her mother and said, okay, we're having to discharge her. She won't stay on her meds. And the mother virtually begged me, please don't do that. I'll come up and we'll talk to her. We'll find out why she went off her meds. We're good. I have an ally to ask those questions. So maybe me and the mother can find out why she did that. So, one Friday afternoon, she drove up from South Georgia. It was several hours it took her to get there. And we pulled her daughter in there, and both of us are, hammering her. Why did you go off your meds? And she said same thing, all the side effects. And then I told her, okay, which worse, the side effects of being crazy? she said, being crazy. And then I said, well, then why'd you go off your drugs? And she said, you won't believe me. And said, try me. You know, I've heard some pretty strange stuff while I've been here. And she said, the voices were telling me the psychiatrist was poisoning me. And they were pointing to the side effects, the awful side effects of those drugs as proof that she was being poisoned. And I went, click, you know, because I've heard that from schizophrenics before. The psychiatrists are poisoning me. You know, so it turns out the voices are telling them that psychiatrists are poisoning them. And I went, I'll bet you that accounts for the psychiatrists being assaulted at the rate they're being assaulted. The voices don't like those drugs.
Yeah.
And that turned out to be true. The voices don't like those drugs because they're major tranquilizers. The voices want them upset because what they're doing is they're actually feeding them. You know? And that was another pattern that I discovered in the psych hospital. You talk to these guys, after the voices attack them, their energy level drops down to nothing.
Oh, interesting.
And it's like, it's happening all the time. It's happening, you know, when after the voices attack, their energy level drops down to nothing. But they really don't notice it because it feels bad. The whole thing feels bad. You know, so they're thinking that's just part of feeling bad because of the voices, you know. So they're not able to isolate it. So I started asking them, well, you know, they admit that after they think about it, they admit that, yeah, my energy does leave. And I ask them, well, where do you think it went? And they would go, again, I don't know. You know, I don't know. And I said, well, you know, the voices have probably come hundreds of thousands of times over the years you've been around. And every single time that they came, your energy level was gone. Where'd your energy go? You know, you didn't use it. You were laying in bed all night while they were attacking you at night. And you weren't digging ditches or anything like that. And they would say, I don't know. I don't know where it went. And then I'd say, well, listen, if you stuck your hand in a fire 1,000 times and every time you got burned, what's burning you? They had no trouble with it's fire. But I said, well, okay, if the voices came 1,000 times, every time every time the voices came, your energy went down to nothing. Who's taking your energy? They still had a hard time going, it's the voices. You know, some of them did. Some of them went, the voices, you know, like it was a new thing to them. But they were being blocked from that.
Making a connection.
That knowledge, making that connection, you know.
And that doesn't happen with hallucinations? People's energy level doesn't drop after hallucinating?
No, not after just, you know, kind of medical hallucinations, that kind of stuff. No, they don't. They're not completely devoid of energy. I've had some patients that they were so drained of energy they couldn't even get out of bed. They couldn't even move out of bed. They were so drained. And this was consistent. It happened every time the voices came.
Wow.
So that was the third. One I thought. But the voices didn't like them being calm. They didn't like the tranquilizing effect of the drugs. They wanted them feeling anger and anxiety and paranoia and guilt and shame and all these other negative emotions. And if they were not feeling that bad stuff, then they had a harder time draining them. Right?
Oh.
So they're feeding off of that negative emotional energy. That's their food source.
Wow.
So you tell this to psychiatry and they'll go, oh, you're crazy. You're crazy. It's a bed bug. But you think they'll look into it? No, they won't. It's right in front of their eyes. All they got to do is freaking open their eyes.
Yeah.
They refuse. They're like walking around like this. Drugs, everything.
Wow. The blind leading the blind.
Yeah, schizophrenia is not a physiological illness. It's a spiritual malady. It's a spiritual thing. It's not a physical thing. The only reason those drugs work is because they calm the patient down. They're major tranquilizers. They don't cure anything. Matter of fact, none of their psychiatric drugs cure anything. All they're doing is treating symptoms, and they're making billions of dollars a year doing it. So here's antidepressant drug market in the U.S. is expected to reach 15.98 billion by 2 billion. Not million, billion by 2023.
Wow.
And these are the guys that, all of them, they're saying, oh yeah, this is a chemical imbalance anyway. It's already been disproved, but yet they're selling these drugs based on a chemical imbalance, which is curing absolutely nothing, and they're making a fortune on them, billions of dollars. Global antipsychotic sales to hit $14.54 billion in 2021 and expected to reach $15.5 billion by 2022. This is billion. It's not million, it's billion.
Listening to one of your other interviews last night, and Sherry Sweeney was on there too. And one thing she mentioned, she said it took you a while to get to the point where you recognized that the voices were actually entities of their own. Can you tell me how that happened, that realization?
Well, it took years because I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe in demons, or that these things were demons. I was thinking, well, it's something wrong with their subconscious, or something happened to them early on that did something. And there was truth to that, because virtually all the schizophrenics had some kind of trauma in their background, bad trauma, or bad drug use, And I was like, asking them what's going on. And then I found out that the voices ran patterns. So you can go to my website. Anybody who's working with schizophrenics, you can see these patterns for yourself. Go to my website at jerrymarzinsky.com, then go to articles. There's a list of those patterns there, and those patterns are an operational definition of what these voices are. Okay? And there's 23 of them. So, basically, here's some of them. They're consistently negative. They're anti-religious. They foster and create negative emotion. They energetically drain their victims. They get louder after sunset, which is weird. They get louder if they're ignored. They will not be ignored. I've heard psychiatrists tell patients, oh, just ignore them. They're hallucinations. That makes them worse. That you try to ignore them, they get louder. They foster self-destructive behavior. Like I was telling you, they sabotage the person. Anytime they try to do something positive, like they did in the hospital where they're approaching graduating from classes, the voices sabotage them. They foster isolation. So they'll tell the schizophrenic person, go in your room and just stay there. Stay away from everybody. Don't listen to anything your parents tell you. Don't do anything they tell you. Just go in your room and make a big fuss so they don't want to deal with you. And then they're in there 24 hours a day listening to the voices. They demand the attention of the victim. They maneuver for increased control over the victim. They gaslight them. They manipulate perception. They have complete access to the schizophrenic's memory, so they can go into the person's memory and pull up all the rotten things they ever did and throw them in their face to generate that negative emotion, that generates that negative emotional energy that they feed off. They don't want the victim to tell anybody about the voices. So it took some doing to get them to talk about their voices. And it goes on and on and on. There's 23 of these patterns. And if the voices are running patterns, they're not hallucinations. Hallucinations don't run patterns.
Well, another thing that they say is that the mind is split, right? That's what schizo is a split, right? And that I've heard one schizophrenic who actually became a psychiatrist, I believe, and she said that she thinks that it's her mind split and that those voices are another part of her mind that she's cut off from. So how would you distinguish? How can you tell that that's not what's happening?
Because those thoughts don't come from the mind. They come from outside the head. All your thoughts do. You know, they've never found a thought in a person's head. With all the autopsies they've done, they haven't go, oh, here's a thought here. You know, matter of fact, there's so many thoughts that you couldn't, you know, and memories that your brain couldn't keep up with it all. On top of that, you know, every 10 years, your whole brain changes. I mean, it's not the same cells anymore. So those thoughts are coming from outside, you know, and if you think those thoughts are you, then who's the one who's listening to them?
Yeah. So are any of our thoughts ours?
No, you're the one who's listening to them.
Okay.
Those thoughts come from, you know, your history. You've been brainwashed ever since you've been a little kid. You've been told what to do, what to think, how to behave. You know, you've had a bunch of different experiences, so everybody has different thoughts. But you're the one who's listening to them. Those thoughts are not who you are. They give you a feeling of that's who you are.
Right.
But they're not you. You're the one who's in the background listening to them. That's you. Now, if you choose to believe them, then you can make them come true. And that's what's so dangerous about the schizophrenic thoughts, because they're always telling you negative stuff. And if the person believes what they're saying, they're gone. You know,
Yeah.
It's like, and even your regular thoughts, you don't know whether they're lying to you or not. You don't know if they're believable or not. Just like all the years I spent studying psychology. And then when I got onto the front lines, I found out a whole bunch of it had nothing to do with the clinical part of psychology. You know, that the counseling stuff just didn't work with schizophrenics. And it doesn't work well with anybody. You know?
Yeah.
But, you know, there is something that does work well. It's called the MACE Energy Method. I'll talk about that later, but it's the only thing I've seen that actually works.
Okay. Is that so? What happened in your friendship with Sherry Sweeney to lead you down this path? How did you start thinking?
Well, what I was doing is so after I got out of the state hospital, I went into a PhD program. When I left there, I came to Arizona and I got a job with the Arizona State Prison in the psychology department there. That's where I learned the most about what's going on with schizophrenics, because I didn't have to worry about psychiatrists breathing down my neck and threatening me if I was asking questions. They were overwhelmed anyway, you know, and they kind of did their own thing, and I didn't really have to work with them except to turn in, you know, prisoners who were really getting out of control. That was kind of our job with psychiatry. So I formed groups of schizophrenic prisoners who were as curious about the voices as I was, you know, because they didn't know what they were either.
Yeah.
And I made a deal with them. I said, if you tell me what the voices are telling you in real time when we're working together, you know, I'll help you all I can, and we'll see if we can't figure this out. So I always had a group of 11 or 15, you know, because they wouldn't all do that. You know, the vast majority of them didn't want to talk about their voices. They didn't want anybody to know about them. They're trying to keep them to themselves, and that's what the voices wanted. You know, but these groups were like gems for me. Every time I found one that was willing to do that, I'd spend hours talking to them. Where the other psych people, 15, 20 minutes, they're done with them. They go, this guy's out of it. He doesn't make any sense, and get out of there. You know, there's nothing I can do for this guy. I can't even talk to him, you know. But I'd spend hours with him, and these patterns started appearing. So I'd give them homework to, you know, to try to trip up these patterns. I started thinking, what happens if I start interfering with these patterns that the voices are running? And I'd give them homework to do things that interfered with the patterns or went opposite of what the pattern was saying. And then they'd come back and they'd go, well, the voices don't like it. They don't like you. They don't like the patterns. They don't like us coming here. They want us to quit. You know, so the voices didn't like it.
They want to be the boss and tell the person what to do, right?
What?
They want to tell the person what to do, and if they start disobeying them, they get upset.
Yeah, they got upset. But these guys came anyway. You know, so I have to hand it to them. even though the voices are giving them problems. And some of them got headaches. A lot of them would complain that the voices were just screaming bloody murder as they were walking to my office.
Oh, wow.
But they came anyway. So these patterns started appearing over and over and over again. And, I was giving them things to interfere with the patterns, and the voices weren't liking it.
Mm-hmm.
And then they one by one, they came by and they said, the voices don't like this. They don't like you doing this. They don't like us, answering your questions. They don't like us coming here. But they all came anyway. I don't think any of them backed out because of the voices, which was very interesting to me. So we started finding stuff that interfered with them, and these guys started getting better. The voices got less and less, and they came less and less frequently. And then one by one, all of them came in and said the voices don't like this. And then one guy, after talking with him one afternoon, he stops in my doorway as he's leaving the office, and he looks at me and he goes, "You know what you're doing is dangerous, don't you?" And I didn't think so. Then I'm like, "Well, they're stuck in your head. They're not in me, So it didn't make any sense. But I didn't disregard it. I paid attention to it, but it was like the guy that, the clinical psychologist who said that two crazy guys met each other, that one of them would have to change. So that was kind of how this was. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to disregard it. I'll store it. It fits in somewhere. And it was like a warning, So they kept coming back, and the voices didn't like what I was doing, and these guys started getting better. The voices were coming less and less. They weren't as strong. And then another guy, he comes in one day. He didn't have a pass to get into the psychology department. So I don't know how he got in there, but he got in there somehow. And knocks on my door, and he tells me the voices want to talk to you. And I'm like, yeah, that's my thing. Whoa, they want to talk to me personally? He goes, yeah, they want to talk to you personally. That had never happened before in like 20, 25 years or more of dealing with schizophrenics. I never talked to them directly. It was always, I would tell the patient something, and then the voices would say something back. And then I'd say something to the patient, tell them this. And then the patient would say, this is what they're saying. And that's how it went for decades. I'd never had them talk to me personally. So that took me aback. So I said, okay, come on in. We sat down, and I asked the prisoner, I said, okay, what do they have to say? And these words came out of his mouth. You have no right to interfere with our way of life. And I'm like, boom. It's like they are entities, And then I look at the prisoner, and I'm like, kind of give him like this, and he goes, no, that wasn't me. He said, that was them. It wasn't me. I did not say that. And he was honest about it,
Yeah.
And
oh my God.
By then I had overwhelming evidence that these things were not hallucinations, but I didn't want to believe it. I went on for more than 20 years accumulating all this evidence, but I didn't want to believe that these were separate entities. When that happened, it was like my denial system just collapsed. It just fell apart. I was stunned. I was absolutely stunned, and, after he left, I just sat there staring out the window. I canceled all my appointments for the rest of the day and just stared out the window like, what's going on here? This is crazy. This is what, it's like a whole different world, that I was learning about it. I didn't know what it was. I'm seeing the patterns that ran. I didn't know how dangerous it could be. I know that some of these schizophrenics could get very violent. I know some of them were in prison for killing people, and I was virtually certain it was the voices that were egging that on. So I didn't know exactly how dangerous they were. So one thing I was good at, and I can attribute this to my dad, who was a rageaholic, is the only way I could get back at him when I was a kid and he was raging was to just drive him to the brink of blowing up and then backing away and leaving him with the load. You know,
Yeah.
but if you misjudged, the
Yeah.
repercussions were devastating. You know, but I became very good at it. So I was able to push these guys to their breaking point without setting them off almost 98% of the time, you know. So I was able to get more information out of them than most anybody else, you know, because I could sense when they were getting to the point of going off, you know.
Yeah.
So, and also I'm an adrenaline junkie, or I was. I'm getting older. I'm too old now to be an adrenaline. But back then, this was all exciting, you know. But when that happened, that was too much excitement, you know. When that happened, and I was like, I don't know how dangerous they could be. I had no idea.
Now, was that the same instance where you audibly heard a sound in your office for the first time?
That was like a month or two later. So after I recovered from that shock, I didn't stop working with these guys. I kept asking them questions, but I knew now that the voices were entities.
Yeah.
You know, and okay, I told you about the guy that was dangerous, and then, well, first of all, one guy came to my office to start with, even before this guy came and said the voices want to talk to you. One guy said they were dangerous, told me that. Okay. Mm-hmm. Then this incident with the voices telling me you have no right to interfere with our way of life. Our way of life, plural. It wasn't just my way of life. They're talking in the plural. And they weren't referring to the patient, you know, because the prisoner, he wasn't any part of that. You know, he was lucid when he was talking to me. So the next thing that happened is I was asking these questions all the time. I was asking these guys hundreds of questions. I was always asking them questions. I was bringing in stuff. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? So I was reading a book by Miguel Ruiz that was called The Voice of Knowledge. And he was talking about these things being parasitic entities also. Okay. And I brought that into the prison, and I was asking one guy I was working with, it might have been the guy, I don't know if it was or not, I don't remember whether it was the same guy who said, you know, you have no right to interfere with our way of life. But it was one guy I'd been working with, and I said, I brought in this book, I want to read you a paragraph, and tell me what you think about it. And it was a book by Miguel Ruiz. He was a shaman. He was a South American shaman. But I think he also had a PhD. But he was writing this book, and it was telling about these things being parasites. And so I brought it in, and I had the paragraph outlined, and sat down, and I told this guy, I said, I'm going to read you this. I want you to tell me what you think about it. Okay? So I started reading the paragraph, and then when it got to the point where he was talking about these voices being parasitic entities, that's when that crackling erupted. You know, there was like this electrical crackling that just exploded behind my head, and it sounded just like an electrical arc welder. It was just crackle, just crack, crack, crack. And then it started moving up my office wall to the right, just crackling, loud, you know. And it wasn't just a little burst; it just kept going. And I turned to the patient or the prisoner, and I said, "You hear that?" And he doesn't answer me. He's just staring at me with this zombie look, like just staring. Didn't say a word, just staring. And I'm like, he's going to attack. And I pushed my chair against the back wall just in case he did, so I could kick him off. Like he wouldn't knock me over. And I'm trying to split my attention between watching where this crackling is coming from and watching him, because I didn't trust him. He's looking really strange at this point. And that crackling just proceeded up the wall. You know, it wasn't like a short burst. It lasted for 2 or more minutes. It just kept going. And I couldn't see anything. I couldn't smell anything. I couldn't feel anything, but I could hear it. It was loud. It sounded just like an arc welder. And then it started moving across the back of my office, and I could see him and see where the noise was coming from at the same time. I didn't see anything. but it was crackling loud. It was loud. It wasn't just a little burst. And then it started coming down the left-hand wall where I was sitting near. And it jumped into this Rubbermaid trash can right near my left leg. So I looked down in that trash can, and there's nothing there. There's absolutely nothing there, but the thing is crackling just inches from my leg. And then just like, boom, like that, it stopped. It disappeared, And I'm like stunned. I'm like, what was that? And, I look at him and he slowly gets up and he goes, I gotta leave. And he shuffles out of my office. And I'm like, yeah, go, get out of here, go, get away from me. And then when he left, I started examining the walls. I examined the trash can. I couldn't see any burn marks. There was no evidence that anything had ever happened, And I couldn't talk to anybody about this. There's nobody I could talk to. So I went out in the hallway and I looked to see if there was anything that could have caused that. And there was nothing. It was, the doctor wasn't in. The nurses weren't in yet. The only person in the medical unit was the female guard way down the hall, and she couldn't have done anything to make that noise. So I was stunned. I was thinking, am I starting to go crazy? It's because I couldn't figure it. I was just stunned. So again, I shut off all my appointments for the day and just stared out the window, wondering, where is this going? And what freaked me out the most was I didn't think these things could affect physical reality.
Oh,
I hadn't seen any evidence to that point that they could. It all seemed to be in the patient's head and trying to get the patient to affect physical reality by doing stupid, bad stuff. But I didn't see any evidence that the voices themselves could. This was the first evidence that I saw that they could affect physical reality, because I heard those sound waves. There was no doubt in my mind that I heard that. And I was stunned. There was a physical sound. No, it wasn't just in my ears. It was a physical sound, and it moved.
Yeah.
And it took me probably 3 months before I got the nerve to call that guy back again. I did not want to see him. I didn't want to be anywhere near him. So finally I called him back, and he comes in and he's looking good. He has lots of energy. And that surprised me, because I figured if something like that was in his head, it's tearing him up by now. But no, he looked good. And I said, I told him, I said, you look good. And he goes, well, I'm still fighting the voices. I haven't beat them, but they haven't taken me over either. So it was like a Mexican standoff.
Yeah.
And so we did some small talk, and then I asked him, and I said, "Do you remember the last time you were in my office?" I said, "Did you hear that crackling?" And he goes, "Yeah, I heard it." He said, "I was surprised that you did." And I asked him. I said, "Well, what was that?" And he said, "That was them." And I said, "Them who? The voices?" And he said, "Yeah, that were the voices." So I'm like, that's weird, because I'd heard him talk about them many times. While he was in my office, he was talking about what they said, what they did, what effect they were trying to get him to do. So I kind of knew them, but I didn't know they could do anything like that.
Yeah.
And I asked him. I said, "Well, what in the devil were they trying to do?" And he said, "They were trying to scare you off."
Oh.
And I said, "Well, they did a damn good job of it."
Yeah.
And then I asked him, I said, "You looked really weird when you left my office. I mean, you looked like a zombie." I said, "What were the voices telling you then?" He said, "They were telling me to go get a knife and stick it in your gut, a shank." And I'm thinking, oh, he wouldn't do that. I've been working with him for 6 months. He wouldn't do something like that.
You're right.
And I said, "Well, why didn't you do it?" And he said, "I couldn't find one and nobody would give me one."
Oh my goodness.
I know. And it was like, where's this going? How bad is this going to get?
Very dangerous.
And again, I had nobody I could really talk to. I couldn't tell them about this. I couldn't tell them about what I was learning with the voices. if the psychiatrist found out what I was learning, I'm sure they would have had me fired. They would have said, you're a nutcase.
What about Sherry?
Well, that's where Sherry came in, because there wasn't anybody I could talk to, and I had known Sherry for like 10 years, because we were working on prison reform. Now I couldn't attack my prison system because they could crush me. So she was trying to reform the Alabama prison system, which was much worse than the Arizona prison system. So I was helping her, going, if you do this, this is what they're going to think. If you do this, this will get their attention. Watch out for this. Watch out for this. So I was helping her, and then at the same time, I was telling her, what I was finding out about the voices. And then she'd never talked about anything like this. And then one day after I told her about it, she said, "Oh, I know all about them." And I said, "What do you mean you know all about them?" Because she was probably one of the most spiritual people I knew, And she said, "Oh, yeah, I struggled with them when I was a young woman." And I was like shocked, because she was a diametrically opposed opposite of that. And I didn't believe it. So I started asking her all these questions about, well, okay, answer these questions about the voices then. I'm hitting her one after another, and she was just bam, 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 bam. She knew them all. And I was just shocked. So that shows you how much of a stigma there is with these things, because basically, psychiatry is saying you're crazy, your brain's broken, you're a reject, you're something strange.
Yeah. So was there perception too that they were not her, that they were? Is that typically their perception?
No, she knew that. No, well, it's different. See, all of them struggle with who the voices are. A lot when they start off, they sound just like all the other thousands of voices that you hear in your head during the day, But then they start saying these bad things, and it's usually about the person themselves. Yeah. So if the person's been abused, they already have a bad self-concept. And these things jump in there and they start saying more bad things. You're stupid. You're ugly. Nobody likes you. They start slipping that stuff in. So because they don't sound different than virtually any of the regular thoughts, people think that that's their thoughts, that they belong to them. That's what we're led to believe from the time we're kids, that any thought that comes into your head is you, and that your thoughts are you. Your thoughts are who you are, but your thoughts aren't who you are. They come from outside of you. And especially these. So the schizophrenics struggle with, like, is this me, or is this somebody else, or is this something else? And a lot of them will ask them, they'll ask the voices, who are you? What are you? And the response they get, the voices tell them, and this has happened in many instances, the voices tell them, we are you. They want them to believe that those voices are them. And then they slowly start taking them over by giving them nasty suggestions. Do this or do that, or in some cases they kind of went, and when they first show up, they go, hey, go over there and pick up that pencil. And they see it's like somebody driving a new car to see what it'll do, or go sit down or something like that. They'll see how much control they have over the person.
Yeah. Can it come in images if someone's a visual thinker?
Yeah, they come in auditory and visual hallucinations. So these people will see things also. One of the common things they see is something called the shadow people. They're three-dimensional black shadows that are darker. They come at night usually, and they come. They're darker than the rest of the room. If you turn on the light, they vanish. Most people see them out of the corner of their eye. You'll see something dark dash by, and you look, and there's nothing there.
I think also not hallucinations, but they're actually seeing something.
Oh yeah, you can look them up. Go to Google and look up shadow people. They exist. They don't speak. They don't talk like the voices talk. They just scare people. And most of the time they don't have eyes. The victim can't see eyes. They just see a dark shadow in the room. And they don't always take this form of people. They can take the form of animals or creatures or monsters, but mostly they're three-dimensional shadows. They're not like a two-dimensional flat shadow. They're three-dimensional shadow.
Children with imaginary friends or imaginary animals.
They're not imaginary.
Oh my goodness. Yep.
They actually see them and they're interacting with them. They haven't been brainwashed out of that yet.
Yeah. So where do they come from? Something like...
Well, they're around you all the time.
Yeah.
They're always around. You know, you're just not picking up on them.
Well, and as far as their ability, some of these entities' ability to affect physical reality, it made me think of, I think it was Van Dusen, your friend, who, right when you were working on something important, he died suddenly of cancer.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, we were writing a book together. So where this all came from was that there's a Christian mystic who lived 300 years ago. His name was Emanuel Swedenborg. He was a chief mining engineer for the Queen of Sweden. He was a brilliant guy. He was like Galileo. He knew, he invented all this stuff. He was one of the top scientists of his day. He was making the Queen a fortune with the mines. And at age 50, he said Christ appeared to him and said, "Stop all this scientific stuff. I'm going to give you access to heaven and hell. And I want you to go talk to the residents in heaven and hell, and then come back and write a book about it. Write books about what you saw over there." And he did, and he wrote a book called Heaven and Hell, and you can still get it today. It's still in print. And he talked about it. And when he talked to the evil spirits, Van Dusen saw that the voices... See, Van Dusen was working with the voices too. He was wondering about what the voices were. He was a clinical psychologist up in Northern California. So he was asking these patients about their voices also, but he was trying to make friends with the voices. So he didn't get very far because they're liars. They're consummate liars. They lie about everything. I found out a lot about them because I was trying to destroy them. And when you destroy them, they really show their true selves, what they're about. But he did give, what he did is he got his patients and he gave them, the patient himself. Okay, so they were hearing voices. He told the patient, "I'm going to give you a couple of tests. I don't want you to let your voices interfere with the test. And then I'm going to give your voices a test independently of you, and don't you interfere with what the voices are saying." So he gave the patient MMPI and a Rorschach, and then he gave the voices the same two tests. Now these are like the gold standard for psychology, the test he was given, and it came out that the voices were much more psychotic than the patient.
Wow,
which was interesting. And he also found that the voices would tell them to do bad things. So he found out that in studying Swedenborg, that the voices reacted or acted just like the evil spirits that Swedenborg was talking about in his book.
Oh.
So then I read Swedenborg, kicked on from him, and sure enough, the voices that I was studying matched what Swedenborg was talking about with regard to evil spirits.
Wow.
And that matches perfectly with these voices hating religion and the Bible.
Right.
It all lines up.
Wow. Well, that's interesting because before we got on this call, first of all, yesterday, I hope you don't mind me mentioning, you thought it was our interview yesterday, and you sent me an email that well, but it occurred to me, I was like, well, that could be them, like, trying to mess with the interview, trying to mix us up on the days. And then this morning I had a grocery order coming, they delivered someone else's groceries to my front door, which has never happened before. And my husband had to go find the driver, and we had to call the store, and it's upsetting. It's interfering, and so when I called the store, there was all this static on the line, which never happens on my phone. As soon as I hung up from there was a loud ringing in my ear, which I never get ever. So I was like, okay, I need to pray. And so we were praying, and as soon as I said God's name, I hadn't even gotten into the prayer yet. I don't mind people calling him Yahweh, Jehovah. I call him Jehovah usually. And so as soon as I said that, I could tell they got scared. I hadn't even gotten into the prayer yet. And it's really just amazing to me that they're such cowards too. It's like they just left, and I asked for protection and all of that on us today, so we could focus on this important message for people. But it's just fascinating how they, like you said, it's like worms on a hot frying pan with the divine name of God or of Jesus.
They don't like it. Now, what kind of hallucination would do that? And here's psychiatry going, yeah, they're hallucinations. They won't study these things. Last weekend, I had an interview where we just couldn't get the sound to work. It just wouldn't work. And I tested my sound system. The interviewer tested his sound system. We couldn't find anything wrong with it. So I prayed to St. Michael. I said, hey, come and take care of this. And boom, as soon as I said that prayer, sound came back on. Just like that.
Wow.
I had one time where they actually attacked me through the computer screen when I was working with a patient in my clinical practice. So, there's this, when I was, the last 10 years I spent working, I had spent in the working psych crisis in the emergency rooms all over Tucson, in the different big state hospitals, private hospitals. And I got to where I could feel these things. I couldn't see them, I couldn't hear them, but I could feel them. And it was this icky electrical feeling, unique to them.
Yeah.
And it was so reliable that in the emergency room, some of those guys they didn't want to admit that they were usually brought in by cops or some of the mental health center or something. They didn't want to admit they were hearing voices because they didn't want to be sent to the hospital. And I would ask them, I said, are you hearing voices? And they would lie to me. They'd say, no, I'm not hearing them. I could feel that feeling. And if I felt that feeling, it was 100% reliable. I'd say, yes, you are. And this is how strong they are. So one guy responded back, how'd you know that? Do you hear them too?
Wow.
So what psychiatry is doing, it just isn't working. There's more psychologists, there's more psychiatrists, there's more psychiatric medicines on the planet right now than in the history of mankind. And society as a whole is getting sicker. In the United States alone, there's 50,000 people every year kill themselves. And a good many of them are on psychiatric drugs. That hasn't cured or done anything. Even some of these antidepressants are saying, beware of suicidal ideation. Now, a lot of these people on those antidepressant drugs are killing themselves anyway. And they said that it starts when they start taking those antidepressant drugs. So,
Violence.
or violence, So you look at what psychiatry is doing, and society as a whole, the whole Western world is in much worse shape than they ever have been in the history of mankind. The prisons are overflowing. The psychiatric hospitals are overflowing. The mental health clinics are overflowing. Crime is out of control. These guys are on the street, these homeless people, they're psychotic. And psychiatry is doing nothing to solve the problem. They're just treating symptoms, and they're making a fortune doing it. So it's estimated there's 24 million schizophrenics worldwide, 3 million in the U.S. The CDC reports that 132 people in the U.S. kill themselves every day. 24 veterans kill themselves every day. Suicide is the 11th leading cause of death in the United States. In 2021, 48,000 Americans killed themselves, and that number is increasing every year. So you got probably up to 50,000 now, You got 50,000 people killing themselves year after year after year after year. There were 50,000 people died in the Vietnam War. This is like the Vietnam War, year after year after year. And here's the main treatment is psychiatry, pouring drugs on people's brains, not curing absolutely anything at all.
Yeah.
And the rate is increasing constantly. So 10,000 Americans are diagnosed with schizophrenic every year. Schizophrenia is the top 10 health problems on the planet right now, according to the World Health Organization. And what they're doing right now is curing nothing. But I have found something, it's called the MACE Energy Method. It's an energetic psychotherapy. Doesn't work anything like regular psychotherapy. It deals with energy. Okay? And that's what your thoughts are. Your thoughts are energy. Your mind is energy. Your feelings are energy. It deals with energy. And like Tesla says, the universe can be explained by energy, vibration. That's what this thing does. And there's a spiritual component to it also. Without that spiritual component, it won't work. So I haven't seen anything out there that works like this, but they don't want it. They don't want it out there because if it caught on, it would interfere with their income. Right?
Yeah,
So John Mace, who discovered this, he spent his lifetime working on this. He wanted to know how the mind worked, just like I wanted to know how the mind worked. Okay, so I was finding out this stuff with the schizophrenics. And, we all hear those voices. They all attack us all from time to time. You're stupid. Why'd you say that stupid thing? You're dumb. But it doesn't last. Like the schizophrenics, it's 24 hours a day. It's just constant. You're no good. You're worthless. We're going to kill you. They hear the voices plotting behind their back about how they're going to kill them. Stuff like that. It's bad. But Mace wasn't a psychologist or psychiatrist. He was a ship captain. He drove these big freighters back and forth across the ocean. So he had to know about magnetism. He had to know about electricity, had to know about, the way the electricity flowed. He had to know about navigation and geometric fields and all that kind of stuff, all the science involved with it. He saw that energy flowed from negative to positive. It's just the way it flowed. And he determined that energy flowed in the human body from negative to positive also. So he found that most psychiatric or psychological problems originate during a trauma.
Yeah.
And you can talk to these schizophrenics and virtually all of them are badly traumatized. They're either, physically, sexually, or emotionally traumatized. And that trauma is stuck with them. So what Mace says is that what happens in a trauma is you get a terrible feeling and it just doesn't go away. It stays there for weeks and weeks and weeks. And at the time of the trauma, you make a decision as to the part you played in that trauma. Was it your fault or what part of that trauma belongs to you? And you don't make good decisions during a trauma. So it's always a bad decision. Eventually the ego shows up and it says, this isn't adoptive. You can't survive this way. Let me handle this. I'll get rid of it. So the ego takes the trauma and the decision and it locks it into the subconscious mind and locks it down. So the patient is no longer aware of it unless something brings it up. Okay, so it's like a button. There are people like, oh, he's pushing my buttons. Well, this is one of those buttons. It's loaded into the subconscious mind. It's negative emotional energy and a decision also. And it's in there alive. It's locked down. So the way it shows up is like when somebody who is similar to the person who traumatized you shows up in your life, that thing goes off. And it says, this guy's getting too close to you. He's too close to the person who traumatized you in the first place. You either need to attack him or run from him or avoid him, and it orders you to do that. So this is like the person you hate, no matter where you go, that person shows up. You can go from here to China and that person you hate is show up in China, a person like that. So it's not that out there. It's in here. Okay.
Wow.
So it's buried in there. And Mace says it's projected outward, so you can't see it. Okay. So it's telling you to attack out there. The problem isn't out there. It keeps reappearing over and over and over again every time that particular type of person shows up. And the way it shows up is one, where you get set off by a person like that. The second way it shows up is when you get into a jam and you've been in that jam 2 or 3 times before and you swear to yourself, I'm never going to get into this jam again. And 6 months later, you're right back there again. And you go, how did I get here? I swore to myself I wouldn't ever get here again. It's that negative identity. So what MACE found is that there's a way to track down from that trauma to that negative identity, to identify and outline what that negative identity consists of, right? And then turn it into an image, and then make an apparatus that will go from, it's like a wire or connection that'll go from that negative energy to the spirit, which is positive energy. Okay. So what you do is you create that, and then through your attention, you can actually drain that negative identity down until it vanishes. It's no longer there. And it happens within an hour. And I've been doing it for, 3 or 4 years now. And it's for most people who are traumatized, it's like magic. In an hour, they remember what happened in the trauma, but there's no emotional baggage left with it. There's no negative feeling left with it. That's gone. And you ask them, okay, go back to that trauma now. How do you feel about it? And they go, okay, I remember it, but it doesn't have any impact anymore.
Oh, so is it talking? Is it a technology?
It's a technology. It's not talking. There's a number of steps that you have to do to create that bridge between that negative identity and the person's spirit. Now, the person doesn't even have to know that the spirit is there. Once the bridge is connected, the spirit will take care of it. So it doesn't revolve it does, the person's spirit is necessary because that's the thing that does the work.
Yeah.
That's the thing that absorbs the negative energy. But it doesn't absorb it, it transmutes it. So it changes it to positive energy. It doesn't destroy it. It changes it. And then when we're done, the person feels more energy. They feel lighter. They feel clear. A lot of people wake up and they go, oh, everything's so clear. I've never experienced things that clear before.
Wow.
Within an hour. So I feel bad for, a lot of these, 65, 70, 80-year-old people who something happened to them when they were kids. And they made a decision that I'm worthless or I'm stupid. And they've been living with that their entire life. And then they made it come true because they believed it.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it's gone. It's almost like magic.
Wow. Is it a machine or?
No. It's a technology.
So, can you give us some idea of how you walk someone through that? Like, what is it? Do they have to be there in your office, or can it be?
No, you can do it over the internet. I'm working with people all over the world over the internet. You just walk them through. The only time it doesn't work is if they cannot form an image.
Oh.
So you identify that negative identity. You ask them, what does it look like? If they can't form an image of what it looks like, this thing doesn't work. But I'd say 95% of the time or more, it does.
Wow. Well, that's really fascinating. One thing that strikes me when you talk about how they drive people to kill themselves or to kill someone else, and your connection to the evil spirits that Swedenborg talked about, and also the drugs. I've thought about the Greek word pharmakia, that's often translated sorcery or druggery.
Mm-hmm.
It has its roots in the use of drugs in divination, and just seeing the connections between either prescribed or illegal drugs. And I'm wondering if those could be openings to these spirits. I know trauma can be a doorway.
Yeah, well, especially methamphetamine. Methamphetamine opens people up to these things and they just jump right in there. The prison was full of psychotic methamphetamine addicts. It's one of the most dangerous drugs out there. I've seen more people go psychotic on amphetamine than virtually any other drug. And the way it starts, they take it and then they start hearing things. and they go, oh, that's just a hallucination. When I come down, it'll go away. And it does. It may do that 10 times or 20 times or 50 times. And then one day it doesn't. It doesn't go away. And they're hearing those voices and they're just as psychotic as anybody else, So that, also, cocaine. I've heard cocaine will in some cases turn people psychotic. But these drugs that the psychiatrists are using, here's some research was done by neuropsychopharmacology, and this was in 2005. It said in the past 2 decades, countless medical studies have been done that use the neuroleptic psychiatric drugs, which are antipsychotic drugs. They're associated with the structural brain changes, especially when taking high doses for a long time. So what these drugs that the psychiatrists are using to treat the symptoms of psychosis are actually shrinking the brains of these patients. They're neurologically damaging them. Okay? So these brain changes can include actual shrinkage of the higher level parts of the brain. The shrinkage can be seen in the brain scans and autopsy studies. In response to industry defenders who claim that this shrinkage is from mental illness, so what they said when these researchers found it was doing psychiatric damage, it was doing neurological damage. They go, oh no, it's not our drugs, it's the schizophrenia doing this, So
schizophrenics who were not on those drugs, did their brain shrink too?
Other patients who were taking other drugs at the same hospitals, or if the schizophrenics weren't taking drugs, their brains weren't shrinking. So their defenders. Here's the psychiatric mafia and big pharma saying they claimed that the shrinkage was due to mental illness, but studies show that neuroleptics lead to similar brain changes in animals. So the researchers started feeding monkeys and rats and mice with these antipsychotic drugs, and their brains shrunk also.
Oh my goodness.
So while the medical side of this large library, this information, the public medical side of the library does not. So they're not putting this out. In other words, the public, patients and their families are not being informed about what these medications are doing to the patients over long term. They're not telling them about it.
Oh my goodness.
So those drugs can not only shrink their brain, but it can actually cause death.
Oh, wow. Well, and back to these evil spirits, they're famous for loving blood sacrifice. They love the negative energy and that kind of thing. I'm sure they love it when people die, too.
Oh, yeah. Or if their brains are rotted out.
Yeah. They're easier to manipulate.
So those drugs are very dangerous. Tardive dyskinesia is caused by some of the newer antipsychotics. It's not as bad as with the older ones, but this means that the mental health industry has falsely reassured millions of people since the 1990s that the risk of tardive dyskinesia is lower than what it really is. Tardive dyskinesia can range from mild twitches to extremely disfiguring spasms. So they're lying to patients about what these drugs do, or they're just not telling them. So they're bullcrap that the voices are hallucinations is a lie. It's bullcrap. Their DSM, their Bible of psychiatric diagnoses is bullcrap. It's all made up by them. Their biochemical imbalance bullcrap is a lie, all made up by them. This is the most deceptive medical branch in existence.
Yeah. Wow.
These people they've been lying to the whole Western civilization for decades, and they're making a fortune selling these toxic drugs that they got people believing that they're going to cure something. None of those psychiatric drugs cure anything. Now, the MACE Energy Method will. Those people are cured. They're done. It doesn't come back. So if they're depressed, that depression doesn't come back. If they're feeling, they're worthless, it gets rid of that and it doesn't come back. I mean, it's actually curing stuff. But these people don't want that kind of stuff out there.
No.
So I've got a couple of videotapes on that on my website at jerrymarzinsky.com. You can go look through it. I've got a couple of MACE therapists along with myself talking about it. But MACE himself wrote a couple of books that aren't real complicated that talk about how it operates also. They're called Causism because it gets at the cause of the psychiatric problem, and Energy Over Mind. Both of them by John Mace. So if you want to know more about it, you can read up on it through those two books.
Wonderful. Wow. So where can people go to learn more about your work and possibly get support or tools to reclaim their peace and clarity?
Well, they can go to my website at jerrymarzinsky.com. I have a register where they can register for MACE sessions through the internet on my website. And they're done, no matter where you are, I'm talking to people all over the world. I'm a bit backed up. I'm backed up to the middle of August now, but I can get you on the schedule. And if not, I could refer you to another MACE therapist. There's only like 100 of us on the planet right now.
Oh, wow.
They don't want it out. The people who came up with the mess, they went to the university, a big university in Australia, because it was developed in Australia. And they showed the professors at the university and the administrators how well it worked. And the administrators say, you give us the patent to it, and maybe we'll promote it. And the organization went, screw you, we're not going to give you the patent to this. So they took it up to the Australian legislature and showed them how well it worked. And they just didn't do anything with it. The MACE people were saying, this is what you should be using in your mental health centers, not these drugs.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the psychiatric mafia and big pharma are billionaires. They got the money to run all these false advertisements, making you think that they have an answer to anything. They don't have the answer to any mental illness. All they're treating is symptoms. They're not getting at the cause of any mental illness at all. And most of the drugs they use have toxic, long-term, destructive effects on the neurological system.
Yeah. And, one thing I thought of when you mentioned how the voices of that one person told you, you have no right to interfere with our way of life. It kind of sounds very similar to the message you got from the psychiatrist. It's like, don't interfere. Don't ask questions. That this is our way of doing things.
Yep. That's exactly right. You have no right to interfere with what we're doing.
Yeah. And
same message.
Yeah, and you referred to the psychiatric high priest of mental health. I love that quote from one of your blogs. And I've even heard some people suggest that the white lab coat may have ancient symbolic ties to priesthood. And historically, priest roles did include counseling and healing. And it's just interesting that these people don't really understand who they might be working for.
Yeah, for the most part, I've found most of them very arrogant. There were some good ones who were workable, but, they don't understand anything about the voices, so they don't know how dangerous some of these guys are. Because they know nothing about the voices and what the voices are telling them, or how strong the voices are, or any of these indicators, So they have no measure of how much better the patient is getting, because a lot of times the patient already knows that if they keep telling the psychiatrist that they're hearing voices, the psychiatrist is just going to keep giving them more and more drugs. And they're already feeling like a zombie. They don't want any more drugs. So a lot of them are just lying to the psychiatrist and saying, oh no, the voices are getting less, or I'm not hearing them anymore. I'm okay. And here's the psychiatrist telling people this is a life sentence. Once you start hearing voices, you're dead. It's a message of doom. You've got to take these toxic drugs for the rest of your life. There's nothing else that could be done. It's bullcrap. I had a number of schizophrenics completely get rid of the voices. It's doable. It can happen.
I believe it. I was in really bad shape years ago, and I'm fine now, and those drugs really didn't do anything to help me. They damaged my body, and it's a temporary crutch until you find something that can actually heal you. And it keeps you from dealing with what's really going on, too.
It does. It does. It's like the only way you can survive is on these drugs. You know, now that doesn't mean there's some people that don't need those drugs. I mean, working in the prison, working in the emergency rooms, there's a lot of people that need those drugs because you can't control them any other way. They're out of control. Where the voices are so strong, there's no reaching them. You know.
Do you think it would be better if they were used temporarily, though, instead of?
Well, for most people, yeah, I think they should be a temporary crutch, and then find a MACE therapist. You know, they're all over the world. We're spread all over the world, and there's more coming online all the time. But yeah, and I've worked with schizophrenics with MACE, and if their voices are very strong, they'll show up and they will actually interfere with the patient forming an image. They'll get headaches, they'll get body aches, not be able to concentrate. The voices will interfere, you know. But in a lot of cases, they won't, you know. So if nothing else, MACE gets rid of the trauma that they suffered, that these entities feed off of. But once you start removing the trauma, then the voices have less negative stuff to feed off.
Interesting, because trauma can, like I mentioned earlier, work as a doorway to let those in. What about deliverance ministry? Have you ever seen anyone get good results from that?
Yep. I've watched it firsthand. You know, I've seen them get rid of those things, but they might get rid of the voices, but they don't get rid of the negative identities. So that, you know, the voices are gone, but the negative identities, the trauma is not gone. The results of the trauma. That's where MACE comes in. It gets rid of that, you know, that trauma, and and the voices feed off of that trauma. So, like, you know, like it says in the Bible. I mean, it's weird to, you know, this society is supposed to be a Christian society, you know, and Jesus, you know, cast out spirits out of 23 people in the Bible, right? And yet here's psychiatry and everybody else don't believe in evil spirits. That's the best trick that the devil and the demons have ever pulled off. Because if they can get you not to believe in these things, then they have free reign. It's like having a rattlesnake in your bedroom and not believing it's there.
Right, exactly. I definitely recommend Jerry's book, An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind. Visit Jerry's website at jerrymarzinsky.com. And also, Jerry recommended Sherry Sweeney's, that's the co-author, That's a Lie program that helps schizophrenics fight back against their voices. It's on Jerry's website, jerrymarzinsky.com, under the article section. And we'll also include the link to Sherry's website and blog, keyholejourney.com and keyholejourney.wordpress.com in the description. So thank you, Jerry, so much for your courage and your clarity. And to everyone listening, I hope this conversation sparks you to reclaim your peace and question what you've been told and walk forward with your eyes wide open. Thank you so much, Jerry.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for watching. If this interview left you thinking or feeling the weight of what we're really up against, I want to offer you something to help you stay grounded, clear, and spiritually protected. It's a free guide called 3 Essential Oils for Mental Clarity and Spiritual Protection. These are the oils I lean on personally, and I love to share them with you. Just go to bit.ly/oils for clarity and I'll send it right to your inbox. You'll also be added to my email list where I share simple, natural tools for wellness and emotional resilience. Again, that's bit.ly/oils for clarity. I hope it blesses you.